In the shadow of the jagged cliffs of Crescent Bay, a small coastal town in Oregon where the Pacific roared and the fog clung like a second skin, a miracle unfolded that no one saw coming. It was a damp, salt-scented night in late February, the kind where the wind howled through the pines and the lighthouse beam cut through the mist like a blade. At the edge of town, in a weathered veterinary clinic tucked between the dunes, a litter of Belgian Malinois puppies was born. Their mother, Sable, was a legend in her own right, a search and rescue dog who'd braved landslides and wildfires to save stranded hikers. Their father, Rune, was a retired Coast Guard K9, sharp as a tack, with a nose that could find a lost soul in a storm. These pups were bred for duty, destined for greatness. But one among them, the smallest, would rewrite the meaning of purpose. Officer. Mara Quinn stood in the clinic's doorway, her rain-soaked jacket dripping onto the linoleum. She hadn't slept in 2 days, not since her last partner, a K9 named Blitz, was lost in a cliffside rescue gone wrong. Mara had sworn she'd never take another dog, never open her heart to that kind of loss again. But Sable was her dog, her companion through a decade of chaos, and these pups were her legacy. Mara had come to see them, not to choose one. That's what she told herself. Dr. Lena Voss, the clinic's head veterinarian, motioned Mara inside. "They're strong," she said, her voice steady, but her eyes bright with something unspoken. 6 of them all healthy, except one. He's different. Mara followed her to a corner where a heat lamp glowed over a nest of towels. 6 puppies squirmed, their tiny yips filling the air, but one lay still at the edge, his fur a deep charcoal, almost black, with a faint silver streak across his chest. His eyes were open, too soon for a newborn. They locked onto Mara, unblinking, as if he'd been waiting for her. "He hasn't made a sound," Lena said, crouching beside the pup. "Heartbeat strong, vitals normal, but he's aware. Too aware." Mara knelt, her breath catching. The pup didn't flinch or whine. He just watched her, his gaze steady, almost human. "What's his deal?" Mara asked, her voice softer. Then she meant it to be. Lena shook her head. "I don't know. I've never seen a pup this alert at birth. It's like he's already thinking." Mara reached out, hesitant, her fingers brushing the pup's head. He didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned into her touch, pressing his tiny skull against her palm. A shiver ran through her, not from the cold. "I'll call him Shade," she whispered, "because he's quiet, like a shadow." The name felt right, like it had always belonged to him. In the weeks that followed, Shade became the talk of Crescent Bay's K9 unit. While his siblings tumbled and barked, Shade observed. At 1 week, he was walking, his steps deliberate, while the others still wobbled. At 3 weeks, he followed Mara's movements across the training yard without being called, his eyes tracking her like a compass. By 6 weeks, he responded to hand signals no one had taught him, silent cues Mara hadn't even realized she was giving. "He's not learning," said Tom Harper, the head trainer, watching Shade navigate a low hurdle with eerie precision. "He's already known." Dr. Voss ran tests. Shade's neurological scans showed abnormal activity, spikes in regions tied to perception and decision-making. He reacted to sounds before they were audible, to movements before they happened. But what struck everyone was his bond with Mara. He ignored other trainers, refused food from anyone but her. Even Sable, his mother, got only a polite nudge, no warmth. "He's chosen you," Lena told Mara one evening, her voice tinged with concern. "That's rare. It's powerful, but it's risky. If something happens to you, he might not function with anyone else." Mara didn't care. She'd lost too much to believe in risks anymore. Shade was hers, and she was his. At 10 weeks, Against the protests of the training board, Shade was officially paired with Mara, the youngest K-9 assignment in Crescent Bay's history. The decision wasn't unanimous. Too young, Tom argued, too attached. But Mara's captain, Elena Ruiz, saw the way Shade moved with her, like an extension of her own instincts. "Let them prove it," Elena said. And they did. Their first test came during a coastal storm when a fishing boat capsized off the reef. The call came at 2 a.m., rain hammering the station roof. Mara and Shade were dispatched to the cliffs to search for survivors washed ashore. The wind screamed, the rocks slick with spray. Mara clipped on Shade's vest, her hands steady despite the ache in her chest. "Search," she said, her voice cutting through the gale. Shade didn't hesitate. He moved low, nose to the ground, weaving through jagged rocks and seaweed. Mara followed, her flashlight beam bouncing in the dark. Then Shade stopped, ears up, body rigid. He didn't bark. He never did. Instead, he turned to Mara, his eyes catching the light, urging her forward. She scrambled over a boulder and saw it, a man half buried in sand, his leg trapped under driftwood. He was barely conscious, lips blue from the cold. Shade pressed against him, sharing warmth, refusing to move until Mara radioed for help. The man survived, but what stuck with Mara was how Shade had known. Not by scent, not by sight, but by something deeper, something she couldn't name. Back at the station, Lena reviewed Shade's scans. "His brain's wired differently," she said, pointing to a screen of jagged lines. "He's picking up on cues we can't measure, stress, fear, maybe even intent." Mara sat in silence, watching Shade curl up in the corner, his eyes half open but always on her. "He's not just a dog," she said finally. "He's something else." The town began to whisper about Shade, the dog who didn't bark, the shadow who saved lives. But Mara felt the weight of it, the bond, the responsibility, the fear that she didn't deserve him. She'd lost Blitz to a mistake, her mistake, and the guilt still clawed at her. What if she failed Shade too? She pushed the thought down, but it lingered, heavy as the fog that blanketed Crescent Bay. At 12 weeks, during a training drill, Shade's uniqueness became a problem. While other pups responded to multiple handlers, Shade ignored everyone but Mara. He wouldn't take commands, wouldn't eat, wouldn't move unless she was there. Tom pulled her aside. "He's too dependent on you," he said, his voice firm, but not unkind. "If you're out of commission, he's useless to us. We need a dog who can work with the team." Mara's jaw tightened. "He works, he saves. What more do you want?" Tom sighed. "I want him to be safe. For you, for him, for everyone." Captain Ruiz gave them 2 weeks to prove Shade could adapt. Mara tried. She brought in other handlers, Deputy Chen, Officer Lyle, even Tom himself. But Shade sat still, his gaze fixed on Mara, waiting for her signal. "He's not stubborn," Lena said after watching a session. "He's devoted. His world is you." Mara's chest ached. She wanted to protect him, to keep him close. But the doubt crept in. What if they took him away? On the 10th day, during a solo tracking exercise along the cliffs, everything changed. Mara and Shade were running a scent trail, the ocean roaring below. She signaled him to move left, but Shade froze, his body tense, ears twitching. Before she could call him back, he bolted, vanishing into the mist. "Shade!" Mara shouted, her voice swallowed by the wind. She ran after him, her boots slipping on wet rock, her heart pounding. She found him at the edge of a narrow ledge, pressed against a crevice. Inside, barely visible, was a teenage girl, soaked and shivering, her ankle twisted. She'd fallen while hiking, lost in the fog. Shade was curled around her, his warmth keeping her alive. Mara radioed for help, her hands trembling as she checked the girl's pulse. "You knew," she whispered to Shade, her voice breaking. "You always know." The rescue made local news. A 12-week-old canine saving a life in a storm. But Mara didn't care about the headlines. She cared about the way Shade looked at her, like he'd been born for this, for her. The station celebrated, but Tom's warning lingered. "He's extraordinary," he said, "but he's yours alone. That's a strength and a weakness." Mara didn't answer. She didn't need to. Shade was her shadow, her guardian, and she'd fight for him, no matter what came next. The months that followed were a blur of missions and miracles. Shade and Mara became Crescent Bay's unspoken heroes, called to every crisis, lost hikers, stranded boaters, even a child swept out by a riptide. Shade never faltered. His silence was his strength, his focus unbreakable. But the bond that made him extraordinary also made him vulnerable. Mara felt it every time he looked at her, his eyes carrying a weight she couldn't fully understand. He wasn't just loyal. He was tethered to her, heart and soul. One night, a fire broke out in an old cannery at the edge of town. The call came just before dawn, the sky still dark, the air thick with smoke. Reports were chaotic. Possible arson, trapped workers, no clear entry. Mara and Shade arrived as flames licked the building's wooden frame. The heat was oppressive, the structure creaking under the strain. Mara clipped on Shade's vest, her hands steady despite the dread in her gut. "Search," she said, her voice low. "Live alert." Shade moved like a ghost, weaving through smoke and debris. Mara followed, her flashlight cutting through the haze. The cannery was a maze of rusted machinery and collapsed beams. 5 minutes in, Shade stopped, ears up, tail straight. He barked. Once, sharp, urgent. Mara rushed forward, her heart pounding. Beneath a pile of charred crates, she saw a hand, ash-covered, still. A woman, unconscious but breathing. Mara radioed for medics, but the ceiling groaned above them, a warning of collapse. "Shade, heal!" she shouted, lifting the woman over her shoulder. But the exit was blocked, flames surging closer. Shade didn't wait. He darted to a side corridor, barking once to signal her. Mara followed, coughing, her lungs burning. At the end of the hall was a locked metal door. Mara kicked it, but it didn't budge. "Find a way!" she gasped. Shade turned, sniffed, and bolted into a maintenance room. Mara stumbled after him, the woman heavy in her arms. Shade was pawing at a vent, wide enough for them to crawl through. "Good boy," Mara whispered, pushing the woman through first. Then following with Shade ahead. The vent was tight, the metal hot against her skin. Shade led, crawling low, his barks guiding her through the dark. They emerged into cold air, collapsing on the wet grass as fire crews rushed in. The woman survived, but Mara knew it was Shade who'd saved them. He pressed against her side, silent again, his eyes never leaving her. The rescue made national news. Body cam footage of Shade's sprint through the fire went viral. "The Silent Guardian," they called him. But Mara saw the toll it took. Shade didn't sleep that night, his body tense, his eyes fixed on her. Lena warned her later, "He's giving everything to you. Be careful. That kind of devotion, it burns bright, but it can burn out." Then came the letter. It arrived on a gray morning tucked under Mara's windshield wiper at the station. A federal seal, crisp and official. Shade was to be reassigned to a national canine research program in Seattle for advanced behavioral analysis, effective immediately. Mara's hands shook as she read it. "No," she said to no one, her voice breaking. She stormed into Captain Ruiz's office. "They can't take him," she said, slamming the letter down. Ruiz's face was grim. "It's not our call, Mara. They saw the footage, his scans. He's unique. They want him for high-stakes ops." "He's not a tool," Mara snapped. "He's mine," Ruiz sighed. I know, but this comes from above me, above the department. Mara didn't wait for more. She walked out, her pulse roaring, Shade at her heels. That afternoon, 2 federal agents arrived at the training yard. Shade was running drills, his movements fluid, perfect. When he saw the agents, he froze, his eyes flicking to Mara. Agent Carter, a woman with a clipped voice, stepped forward. "We'll ensure he's well cared for," she said. Mara knelt beside Shade, her hand on his neck. "You don't know him," she said, her voice steady but cold. "He's not yours to take." She clipped the leash into Carter's hand, her fingers trembling. Shade looked back once as they led him to a van, his eyes locking onto Mara's. She didn't move, couldn't breathe. The next week was a void. Mara patrolled alone, her steps hollow, her radio silent. She ignored calls from Lena, from Ruiz, from anyone. She kept waiting for Shade's shadow behind her, his quiet presence. In Seattle, Shade was tested: cognition, sensory response, tactical drills. He passed every trial, but he didn't bond. He obeyed, but his eyes were distant. He refused food unless it came with Mara's scent. At night, he lay awake, staring at the door. Back in Crescent Bay, Mara broke. She walked into Ruiz's office and slid her badge across the desk. "I'm done," she said. Ruiz stood, her voice soft. "You're not just losing him, Mara. You're losing yourself." Mara didn't answer. She walked out, the weight of her choice crushing her. Then came the call from Seattle. Shade had been deployed to a collapsed pier during a storm, with workers trapped in the wreckage. He'd found 3 survivors, shielding them from falling debris, refusing to leave until rescuers arrived. But he'd inhaled too much smoke, collapsed on the way out. He wouldn't respond to handlers, wouldn't eat. An agent played a recording of Mara's voice from an old training session. Shade's head lifted, his heart rate spiked. They called Mara, and this time they pleaded. She flew to Seattle, arriving at the facility past midnight. Shade was in a recovery unit, weak but awake. When Mara walked in, his tail thumped once, his eyes brightening. She knelt beside him, tears burning her eyes. "I'm here," she whispered. Shade whimpered, a sound she'd never heard, raw and full of relief. 4 days later, Shade was cleared to return. The feds had no choice. He was fading without her. At the airport, Mara waited, her heart in her throat. When Shade's crate opened, he stepped out, pressed his head against her chest, and exhaled. They were home. Back in Crescent Bay, they rebuilt. Slow walks along the beach, light training, quiet nights by the fire. Shade was different, quieter, slower, but still hers. One morning, a boy appeared at their door, holding a drawing of a black dog with a silver streak. "My sister," he said, his voice small. "She was on that pier. She says she's not scared anymore because of Shade." Mara crouched, her throat tight. Shade nudged the boy's hand, and the boy smiled, a crack of light in the fog. Years later, Shade's health began to fade. Stiff joints, tired eyes. One morning, he didn't rise. Mara lay beside him on the cabin floor, whispering, "Search." His tail thumped once, weak but sure. When he passed, Mara buried him under a cedar tree, a wooden marker reading, "Shade, my shadow." Letters poured in, hundreds, from survivors, children, strangers. One read, "Dear Shade, I sleep better knowing you're out there somewhere." Mara read it again and again, tears falling. She returned to the K-9 unit, not as an officer, but as a mentor. She told new handlers, "It's not the vest that makes them heroes, it's the bond. Fight for it." And every morning, she hung Shade's collar by the door, walked the cliffs, and listened for his steps in the wind. Shade was gone, but his echo lingered, eternal. The seasons turned in Crescent Bay, the Pacific's relentless waves carving new stories into the cliffs. Mara Quinn had settled into a quieter life, her days as a K-9 officer behind her, replaced by the steady rhythm of mentoring young handlers. At the training facility, Shade's collar still hung by her cabin door, a silent reminder of the dog who'd reshaped her world. But the void he left was a tide that ebbed and flowed, some days gentle, others crashing. The letters from those touched by Shade's story, children, survivors, strangers, kept her grounded, but they couldn't fill the silence. Mara thought the hardest chapters were over. She was wrong. One spring morning, as the fog lifted over the dunes, a new call came. A school bus had veered off a coastal road during a field trip, plunging into a ravine. The nearest rescue team was an hour out, grounded by a storm rolling in from the west. Mara was at the training yard, watching. A young Malinois pup stumbled through a scent drill when Captain Elena Ruiz's voice crackled over the radio. "Mara, we need you. It's bad. Kids are trapped." Mara froze, her breath catching. She wasn't active duty anymore, hadn't been since Shade. But Elena's tone left no room for hesitation. "You know the ravine. You know what's at stake." Mara grabbed her old gear bag, the weight familiar but heavy with ghosts. She didn't have Shade, but she had his training, his instincts burned into her muscle memory. At the station, she met Deputy Sarah Chen, a young officer who'd trained under her, and Chen's K-9, a lanky Malinois named Ember. Ember was eager, sharp, but untested in high-stakes rescues. "She's not Shade," Sarah said, her voice tight, with nerves. Mara nodded, her jaw set. "She doesn't need to be. She just needs to be yours." The ravine was a nightmare of mud and jagged rock. The bus tilted precariously against a shattered pine. Rain lashed the scene, and the wind howled, drowning out the shouts of first responders. Mara and Sarah descended with Ember, the pup's ears pinned back but her nose working fast. Mara's flashlight swept the wreckage. "Ember, search!" Sarah commanded. The dog moved, but her steps faltered, overwhelmed by the chaos. Diesel fumes, mud, the distant cries of trapped children. Mara knelt beside her, her voice low, steady, the way she'd spoken to Shade. "You've got this. Find them." Ember hesitated, then surged forward, sniffing along the bus's undercarriage. Mara followed, her heart pounding, memories of Shade flooding back, his calm focus, his unerring purpose. Ember stopped, barking sharply, her paw scraping at a crumpled door. Mara and Sarah pried it open, revealing two children, bruised but alive, clinging to each other. "We've got a live find," Mara radioed, her voice cracking with relief. Medics rushed in, but Ember was already moving, nose low, searching for more. As they worked, Mara felt Shade's presence, not in the rain or the wind, but in her own. Hands steady and sure, in the way she guided Sarah, in the trust she placed in Ember. They found 3 more kids, all alive, though one had a broken arm. The last was a girl, no older than 8, trapped under a seat, her breathing shallow. Ember pressed against her, sharing warmth, just as Shade had done in the cannery fire. Mara's chest tightened, her eyes burning as she helped lift the girl, free. "Good girl, Ember," she whispered. But in her heart, she was thanking Shade. The rescue made headlines, but Mara didn't stay for the cameras. She drove back to her cabin, the weight of the day settling into her bones. That night, she sat by the fire, Shade's collar in her hands, the leather worn but warm. "You were there," she murmured. "You're always there." She didn't cry, but the ache was deep, a tide that never fully receded. Weeks later, a new letter arrived, slipped under her door. It was from the girl they'd pulled from the bus, her handwriting shaky but clear. "Dear Officer Mara, Ember saved me, but my mom says you saved Ember. She says you learned from a dog named Shade. I drew him for you. Inside was a sketch of a black Malinois with a silver streak, standing on a cliff under a starry sky. Mara's throat closed. She hung the drawing above the fireplace, next to Shade's collar. The next day, Mara returned to the training yard, but something had shifted. She wasn't just mentoring, she was building something new. She started a program, Shade's Legacy, to train handlers to trust their dogs the way she'd trusted him. She taught them to listen, not just to barks or signals, but to the unspoken bond that made a team unbreakable. Sarah and Ember were her first success, their partnership growing stronger with every drill. One evening, as Mara walked the cliffs alone, a familiar sound stopped her, a faint crunch of paws in the gravel. She turned, half expecting nothing. But there was Ember, tail wagging, with Sarah trailing behind. "She wanted to see you," Sarah said, a shy smile on her face. Mara knelt, scratching Ember's ears. "You're a good girl," she said, but her eyes drifted to the horizon, where the lighthouse beam cut through the fog. She felt Shade there, in the wind, in the waves, in the quiet strength of a new generation. Months later, at a regional K9 summit, Mara was asked to speak. She brought Ember and Sarah on stage, the young dog sitting proudly at her handler's side. Mara's voice was steady, but her hands trembled as she spoke. "Shade didn't just save lives. He saved me. He taught me that a bond isn't just loyalty, it's purpose. It's what keeps you going when the world feels too heavy." The room was silent, but Ember's tail thumped once, as if she understood. Time moved on, as it always does. Mara grew older, her hair streaked with gray, her steps slower. The cabin stayed the same, a little weathered, a little quieter. Every morning, she hung Shade's collar by the door and walked the cliffs, the drawing from the girl now framed in her living room. The letters kept coming, some from kids, some from handlers, all touched by Shade's story. One read, "Dear Mara, I named my puppy Shade because I want him to be brave like yours." Mara smiled, her fingers tracing the collar's worn edges. One winter, when the fog was thick and the waves roared, Mara felt a shift. She was alone on the cliffs, the wind biting her face, when she heard it again, the crunch of paws. She closed, her eyes letting the sound wash over her. "You never left, did you?" she whispered. There was no answer, but the tide seemed to pause, the air softer for a moment. Mara walked on, her heart full, knowing Shade's echo would carry her through every storm, every silence, until her own steps faded into the sea.